Going forward, the bank must set firm graduation timelines for countries that have long met the graduation criteria. Treating China, the second-largest country in the world, as a developing country is absurd. Recent developments in international finance and trade are deepening the already tense relations between the U.S. and China. This time, the debate has extended beyond issues like the global trade war and high tariffs to the lending policies of global development organizations. The U.S. Treasury Department's attempt to halt a planned $70 billion loan to China and its call on the Asian Development Bank (ADB) to take steps in this regard are bringing the financial dimension of the great power rivalry to the surface. China is no longer a low-income or middle-income country. It is no longer in a position to qualify for such development funds. As a huge economy, it is both unfair and strategically wrong for it to receive such favorable loans, given its fierce competition with the United States, according to Washington. This argument revolves around China's status as a developing country, which the U.S. has raised for years and further expands the scope of the current trade war in terms of global trade logistics, shipping lanes, and tariff policies. The fact that U.S. Treasury Department officials, such as Besant, have called on the ADB to slowly wind down its lending support to China clearly shows that the U.S. wants to squeeze China through diplomatic financial channels as well. Previously, the conflict between the U.S. and China was based on tariffs and mutual restrictions. The trade war, which started especially during Donald Trump's presidency, has intensified with repeatedly increased tariffs, technology embargoes, Huawei, and 5G restrictions. Washington claimed to be aiming to reduce trade imbalances and end China's unfair competition practices. But over time, the tug-of-war has evolved into a confrontation that, given China's size and role in the global supply chain, is unlikely to be easily resolved. The new card the U.S. now wants to play is to integrate international development organizations into this strategy and isolate China there as well. The ADB is an institution that traditionally provides loans to countries in the region for infrastructure, energy, and development projects. Since China is both a shareholder and a borrower in the bank, the U.S. objection is based on the argument that a country that has grown and achieved global competitiveness should not still benefit from these loans. On the other hand, the ADB management takes the approach that it evaluates projects in line with the development needs of member countries, and China has particularly poor regions and large infrastructure needs. Moreover, China has a say in the ADB as a major shareholder and would not want to be deprived of its projects here. Trump's outburst turns into a criticism that the global bank is asleep, continuing to pour money into China while we are limiting imports from this country and pressuring it with tariffs. This implies that the U.S. is trying to curb China not only through tariff policies but through the entire global trade and financial system. Indeed, Trump and like-minded circles believe that China's financial support in various industries, including the electric vehicle (EV) sector, harms international competition. Although there is a user concern at this point that let's address the whole trade war and global shipping lanes, not just EVs, the EV issue is only one part of the trade war. The real issue is China's massive export capacity and its key role in global shipping networks. While the U.S. seeks to slow China down with tariffs and technology barriers, China also wants to use foreign financing to sustain its own infrastructure projects, energy transformation, and industrial expansion. In the eyes of the United States, the ADB's potential $70 billion package is a concession that China doesn't deserve. This is because Washington argues that a country so rich, with such a giant economy and even a strategic rival to the United States, does not need development aid. In addition to all this, trade routes and shipping lines around the world had already suffered major shocks in the aftermath of the pandemic. The supply chain ruptures caused by the pandemic, the container crisis, logistical bottlenecks on Asia-Pacific routes, and the regional effects of the Ukraine war have made global trade flows extremely fragile. In this fragile environment, the U.S. is promoting the China Plus One supply model, telling global companies to move away from China or at least not to be its sole supplier. This policy is leading to the emergence of alternative production bases such as Vietnam, India, and Mexico. China's status as the factory of the world is thus being undermined. If the ADB's huge loans continue to flow to China, Beijing may be able to recoup some of that lost share. But the U.S. wants to put the ADB leadership under pressure by saying, "We." The implications for global shipping lanes could be both short and long-term. In the short term, if China faces financing constraints, It could slow down infrastructure projects and port expansions, partly affecting global shipping capacity. In the longer term, China may try to minimize its dependence on foreign credit by saying, "We have our own banks and investment funds." Still, losing access to low-cost ADB loans is an economic handicap and would be at least a symbolic loss for Beijing. These moves align with the U.S. strategy of unfriendly treatment of China. The tariffs against China were already the epitome of the trade war concept. By making Chinese goods more expensive in the U.S. market, the tariffs eroded Beijing's export advantage in the last few years. This has led to a partial decline in Chinese exports or diversification. However, the trade war alone has not achieved all of Washington's goals. China still maintains its leading position in global transportation networks, has numerous trade agreements with countries in the Asia-Pacific region, and continues to invest in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe through its Belt and Road Initiative. Now the U.S. is taking the fight to another front with the message, "No more money flowing to China through development banks." This ultimately supports the prophecies of a fragmentation of what is known as globalization into geopolitical blocs. Some criticize the global banks as being asleep, not only at the ADB, but also at institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They ask, why is China, now the world's second-largest economy, still a country in need of aid when it can still get project loans from these institutions? China, on the other hand, justifies itself by saying, "Yes, we are a big economy, but there are still development disparities between regions. Western China is poor, urban infrastructure is needed, and foreign financing is important for green transformation." Since the ADB's mission is to support the development of Asian countries, China technically continues to benefit from its support. The U.S., however, argues that this gives China an unfair advantage in geopolitical competition and is contrary to U.S. strategic objectives. Recently, Trump, Biden, or influential politicians in the U.S. Congress have been pressing to end this status for China and cut off its unfair advantages. The dispute is not only economic and financial, but also involves logistics and other areas such as agriculture, energy, high technology, and semiconductor production. In particular, control over global shipping lanes is one of China's great trump cards. It has the world's largest container ports and the largest ship owner capacity. It is quite successful in using this huge capacity as a tool of economic influence. Although the U.S. is trying to develop alternative sea and land routes to balance this logistical power, in addition to high tariffs in the trade war, Beijing's infrastructure investments, Belt and Road Railway projects, and port agreements affect a considerable part of world trade. If the ADB's support is withdrawn, it could make it harder for China to finance some of these projects, perhaps having to fund them entirely from its own state-owned banks or the AIB. This would increase Beijing's debt burden and slow down some projects. In short, Trump, who said, "The global bank is asleep," could take the trade war to another dimension with his message, "We will break this sleep. We will cut the flow of funds to China." The U.S. move could also affect the balance of power in Asia. Countries like India or Vietnam, for example, may align themselves with the U.S., thinking that if loans to China are cut off, more funds will be available to them, and they can expand their industries and become competitors to China. This would accelerate the formation of new trade blocs in the Asia-Pacific. In recent years, Vietnam and India have emerged as manufacturing hubs, attracting more investment from the U.S. and Europe. China is also watching this with concern, worried about its share in global supply chains being eroded. Therefore, being deprived of ADB loans may weaken Beijing's claim that it is still a developing country in Asia and may also cause a loss of diplomatic prestige in these developments. Although the topic of EVs comes up from time to time, the main emphasis is on the trade war and global shipping lines. EVs are only a subtopic of this conflict, as China is the leader in electric vehicle production and the U.S. wants to protect its own manufacturers and curb Chinese competition. The U.S. may be uncomfortable with ADB funds going to China to build new battery factories there, but agriculture, industry, port construction, and railroads are also at the center of this debate. If each project is to be implemented with the approval of the Asian Development Bank, the U.S. may try to block it, saying China is rich enough and should not receive aid. This picture reinforces the criticism that China is